Again, the Albanese government was digging itself into an ever deeper hole on energy. There's simply no logic left in Australia's ban on nuclear power, and the government sounds more and more shrill, even hysterical, in trying to justify it.
In order for us to get to a point of having a civil nuclear industry, we would need to go through the process of establishing it, which is deeply costly, which would take 20 years, and at the end of that, we get 4% into our grid. That's it. 4%. The reality of what we face is you can't go out there and just magic the reactors. You've actually got to go and build them. That costs money, and the people who will pay for it are the Australian public.
On and on it went. Australia's ban on nuclear power is a legal prohibition put in place by the Howard government more than 2 decades back as a concession to the Greens in order to get the legislation passed to rebuild the medical nuclear reactor at Lucas Heights in the Sydney southern suburbs. Because the Greens held Howard to ransom, they were holding up critical work on the reactor that's needed to deliver cancer patients the radiology therapy they need, so holding up the saving of lives. Howard capitulated. Back then, giving the Greens this amendment to give cancer patients then the treatment they needed, well, that was a fair price to pay when there was no question of Australia not using coal and gas to give us the world's cheapest energy. But it's become dangerous folly now when the only way to have reliable and affordable power and keep the lights on is via nuclear energy. Indeed, the nuclear ban has become so absurd given the Albanese government's insistence that nuclear power is absolutely necessary at sea, but somehow absolutely unthinkable on land. This week's statement from the British Labor government that it expected Australia to be part of a civil nuclear partnership, made in a press release and then suddenly withdrawn, just highlighted how out of step the Albanese government is, even with the global mainstream left. Here we have the Biden administration and the Starmer government doubling down on nuclear as the best way to keep energy affordable while still decarbonising, and yet the Albanese government wants nothing to do with it. Labor's attempts to demonise nuclear, as facile and juvenile as they are, without factual basis. First, Albanese and Bowen and the rest said that nuclear was not safe. They ran those stupid little social media cartoons everywhere, the three-eyed fish and other things. But then they eventually dropped that after they were pilloried the world over. Now, I suspect some bright spark on the PM's office eventually said, look, we can't keep saying nuclear isn't safe. After all, we're going to put Australian submariners in a nuclear submarine. We look pretty stupid. And indeed they did. Then they said it would be technically impossible for us to manage it because we didn't have a nuclear industry, all but implying Australians aren't smart enough to do this. Now, eventually, Labor dropped that as well because we will need a nuclear industry to sustain our AUKUS submarines, and we actually have one anyway, albeit it's small and it's based around that existing medical reactor. But we've been handling nuclear in this country for almost 70 years. Apart from being an insult to our country to think that we can't do what 30 plus other countries can. So now the only argument they've seemingly got left is that nuclear is supposedly too expensive. Yet it's not too expensive for France to get almost 70% of its power from nuclear, and for Britain and America to get 20% of their power from the same source as well. So how's it too expensive for us? Besides, the cost argument gets more and more hollow given the skyrocketing costs of the transition from coal and gas to renewables. Now, you hear this all the time from the government that wind and solar are free because that means renewables are cheap.
The sun doesn't send an invoice, the wind doesn't ask you to pay.
What a joke. You pay your bills, you know what's going on. Has more and more renewables made your power cheaper? Well, no, it hasn't. Because while wind and sun might be free, yeah, he's right, they don't give you an invoice, we're all paying through the nose to harness it, to store it, to firm it, and to deliver it to the grid. Last week, there was modelling released from Frontier Economics suggesting that the cost of the government's energy transition was not the $122 billion claimed, but at least $642 billion. So not $5,000 every man, woman and child, but something like $25,000 each. And last month too, the US Department of Energy released a report showing that the total system cost with nuclear was 37% less than a power system run with renewables alone. That's right, 37% less than just renewables if you have renewables plus nuclear. Here's the graph. Now throw in the fact that the Emirates have just built a massive nuclear plant in just a decade at the cost of some $30 billion, and it shows that Labor's alarmism is a lie. Compare the experience in the UAE with our much smaller, snowy 2.0 build, that pumped hydro scheme that's taking more than a decade, with costs having already blown out from $2 billion to $12 billion, and that's without all the extra costs to transmit the power to the grid. Now, put simply, Labor's cost scare doesn't stand up. If the government really thinks nuclear's too expensive, then just remove the ban. Remove the ban and let's see what the market says. Now, if there are no bids or the bids are way too high, well, Labor will be vindicated. But if players flood the market willing to build nuclear reactors here and deliver cheaper energy, well, we're all going to be better off. Well, most of us will be better off. The ones in trouble will be the pig-headed Labor government, whose opposition to nuclear is based on nothing more than out-of-date prejudice.